It's an absolute delight to be here for today's panel discussion on the challenges of reform, something which has certainly been an enduring focus of the CEDA work. In actual fact, in 2013, CEDA published a paper called Setting Public Policy, which noted that there is widespread belief among CEDA members that Australia's recent policy making has not been at a best practice standard. Some reasons that have been given for the presumed decline in quality of public policy debate and execution are a heightened emphasis within governments on opinion polls and responding to perceived popular opinion, changes in the media landscape and its influence on public information, and issues in the relationship between the public service and politicians. And so, 5 years on, these issues remain just as topical and much debated. In fact, the Economic and Political Overview document suggests that this year may not see any announcement of significant new reform. So to get to the bottom of just what is ailing the reform debate in Australia and how we might begin to overcome the challenges, we have an eminently qualified panel here today. Dr. John Hewson, AM, is currently the chair of the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at Crawford School, ANU. His career in politics included 4 years as the leader of the Liberal Party and Federal Coalition in opposition, as well as stints as Shadow Finance Minister, Shadow Treasurer and Shadow Minister for Industry and Commerce. He has also worked as an economist for the Australian Treasury, the RBA, the IMF, and as an advisor to 2 successive Federal Treasurers and Prime Minister. Jane Holton, AO, is a member of the board of ANZ, Clayton Utz, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the US Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. She's also chairman of Volt Systems, quite a great portfolio of things there. She has extensive experience in the delivery of Australian government policies and programs, with nearly 15 years as Secretary of the Departments of Finance and Health. Professor Gary Banks, AO, is a professorial fellow at the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research and a senior fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies. He's also the chair of the OECD's Regulatory Policy Committee and an independent director of Macquarie Group. And of course, from 1998 to 2013, he was the inaugural chairman of the Productivity Commission. So we're going to have 30 minutes of, I think, quick-fire facilitated discussion, and then there'll be an opportunity for some audience Q&A, so please start thinking about your questions. I wanted to start by going back to last year, and we had Ken Henry here at this event, and he talked, when he was talking about reform and politics, he talked about a sluggish complacency that's been undermining the quality of life available to ourselves, our children and our grandchildren. John Hewson, do you agree? Is the situation this dire?
Back in the middle 70s when I went to work for Phil Lynch, and I did so only in the belief that good public policy would be good politics with a relatively short lag. And to pick up Andrew Bahar's comment today, there's only one of the states and territories in this country that you could say that's true of. It's certainly happening in the ACT to some extent, but since then it's just been a drift to short-term, opportunistic, populist sort of politics, which has made genuine reform, which will take time and needs to be implemented with broad-based community and political support over a period of time, maybe over several governments. The probability of that happening, I think, is just almost non-existent. Today, it's the political environment is very negative. As we've seen in recent days, it can be quite personal. But somebody will propose a policy issue for consideration. The other side, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, opposes it. Yeah. And so we just move on to another issue on another day in another location. We don't have any genuine, sustained debate. So I understand Ken Henry's concern of what he called complacency. I know he was very measured in those comments. I know what he thinks personally as well. It's just become very, very difficult to have a sensible policy debate about anything, mostly because of the nature of politics.
Yep. Jane Holton, are you any more optimistic?
So The thing about the term sluggish and complacency, I think we need to split apart. The truth of the matter is, while the majority of the Australian population was seeing real increases in their living circumstances year in and year out, it was pretty hard to go to them and say, you know what, for the longer term good of the country and for you and your families, we actually want you to swallow a couple of nasty little pills. Because it's very hard for people to go, mostly, I see this in my domestic circumstances, so I have trouble getting that there's a longer term threat coming. So complacency amongst the population, maybe you can describe it as that. I think is a little unkind. I think it's very hard to make a case for change to people who feel relatively comfortable. Now, I think we all know that, and it's now getting a lot of coverage, I think that a lot of us have been watching for some time, is the circumstances in relation to real wages growth, i.e. not, has actually pricked now the interest of Mr, Ms, Mrs average. And you're starting to get, I mean, what was it John Howard used to call it? The barbecue stopper. You're starting to get a conversation amongst ordinary people who work in the real economy, people who are not part of us, you know, the kind of Canberra policy wonk echo chamber, who've been talking about this stuff for ages. You're getting people out there in the real world starting to talk about this. And so I think to say sluggish and complacency, I think complacency born of a genuine personal reflection on their circumstances is completely understandable, actually. Sluggish, I think John makes some really good points about why that's been the case. So yes, as a reflection of the macro position, I might be prepared to agree it, but I think it's important to unpick what's underneath it when you come to ask yourself the question, is there an appetite now? Will there be an appetite soon? And how do you actually prick people's interest in reform? So yeah, sluggish complacency, maybe I'd probably describe it in a different way myself, but I accept that we have not been a model of policy reform and innovation. Like a number of the people in this room who are of my vintage that we all saw through the 80s into the 90s, things that we're all, many of us, very proud of being a part of. We haven't seen that for a while, and I think it's more than arguable. If we don't have another crack at that relatively soon, we're going to end up in a bit of economic trouble.
Yep. Gary?
Well, in a way, I wish it was mere complacency, because if it's complacency, you can impress on people and government the urgency of change. But I think, as my colleagues have said, and you in your introduction, there's more than complacency going on. So I think complacency was bred by the terms of trade boom and the mining boom, and I think it's been said that Australians don't handle prosperity very well. We're much better in adversity. And there's another saying about the benefits of a good crisis for reform, but I actually think in Australia we squandered the potential of that crisis and set in train some expectations and some policy modes of behaviour that have actually compounded the problem. So instead of coming out of the crisis a bit like New Zealand did, with a stronger economy and better expectations about the role of government and what needed to be done in reform, I think we've in a way gone back to some of the old rent-seeking and entitlement type mentality that we spent so hard during times when John Hewson was leader of the opposition. The fight back and the reforms of Keating and Hawke and so on, we fought so hard to change that way of doing things. I think we've dropped back a bit. So yeah, what's in a word? But I think there's a far more complex mix of things that are going on in our society, and not only in Australia, but it makes the solutions a bit tougher as well.
Yeah. And Gary, just to pick up on your point around rent-seeking and thinking about reform in the modern age in terms of the media cycle, really sophisticated campaigning from interest groups. I guess really interested in is there any way of dealing with that environment? And you've spoken a lot about, good policy process and analysis and consultation. Is that part of the answer? What can we kind of do?
Well, John's made the point that good policy should be good politics over time. In a way, Fight Back demonstrated the opposite in a way, because Fight Back became a hostage to fortune for the government, Keating in particular, who wanted to win an election, obviously. And so process is very important. And of course, a government has opportunities through good process that an opposition doesn't have. And so good process can bring the people along. There's just been a lamentable lack of good process in public policy in recent years. And we've seen policies appear out of left field, we've seen changes and reversals and so on, we've seen lack of explanation to the public, we've seen lack of consultation when it really counts and so on. So I actually think there's a big opportunity there. I mean, I don't think good process ever goes out of fashion, even if the modes of communication might change. And I just think that we haven't really stepped up to the challenges that we have through the 24/7 media and so on, that we, I mean, talking as governments, haven't really stepped up sufficiently to exploit the opportunities that are there. So it's more challenging, but I also think there are opportunities, and a lot of the lessons from our own reform experience, I think, are still valid, even if the particular circumstances have changed.
And Jane, you've overseen some pretty transformative reforms, particularly in health, in pretty contentious areas with quite strong stakeholders. Do you have any advice on how, those processes were successful and how we might start to apply the same in the current environment?
So I can start by underscoring what Gary said about good process. Things that get sprung on unsuspecting stakeholders in any sector invariably meet a knee-jerk and not a thoughtful reaction. Whether we've lost the art of good process or whether we don't allow ourselves the time to have good process, and I agree with Gary, there are more opportunities in the technology, the way of communicating these days than when even in the early stages of some of the reforms that I did in aged care, in the pharmaceutical benefits area, et cetera, et cetera. But those were processes where ultimately it was a question of figuring out, and I know it's now got a label through a process of co-design, how it is you actually construct a policy which actually delivers good outcome, both to the government, but also to relevant stakeholders. And I made the comment about people swallowing slightly bitter pills. Now, if you look at the process we went through with the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, where we had to have a very complex understanding of the economics and the flows of money in that sector, and we had to think about how it was we could strike an arrangement with all of those parties where everyone took a certain amount of pain, but for the longer term sustainability of something which is actually the second oldest funding instrument, public health funding instrument in the world, the NHS being the first, PBS is the second oldest, and that needed to be made sustainable. But that was close to 2 years of very difficult policy slog with the stakeholders. Now, yes, in a 24/7 cycle, you'd say, well, maybe that's not doable. Maybe today those processes need to be quicker. But fundamentally, something which is the big reveal, I think, is almost destined to have people shoot at it, as opposed to something where you work through the issues thoughtfully. And that's certainly the model that I followed in that portfolio.
And John, just particularly from a politician's perspective, I mean, the mantra has always been about leading public opinion. Is it possible in this modern age to lead, to get out in front of public opinion, given all the things that we've been talking about around the media cycle and campaigning and so forth?
We've seen two real opportunities in the last decade or so. When Rudd came in 2007, I mean, he had a clear mandate to make a lot of change. He had a fairly clear direction for making some of the change. Take climate, for example. He had a distinct process. We're going to have the Garneau report, the green paper, the white paper, the legislation. If I can't get the legislation through the Parliament, I'll dissolve both houses of Parliament. I'll push it through. Now, that was a great strategy on that particular issue. He got all the way to the last one and balked. It was in, February 2010? And that was the end of the Rudd era, really. That was the beginning of the end because he failed to deliver. Yet the electorate through that period and all the vested interests around that cut him a lot of slack to do it. The second chance has been Turnbull when he came in and said, we've had enough of that sort of opportunistic government negativity of Abbott. I'm going to re-establish the cabinet system. I'm going to, no more slogans, genuine policy, all options on the table. Just wonderful list of quotes. None of them adhered to or delivered. And so he lost an opportunity. He raised enormous expectations and failed to deliver against any of them. So I think he's had the fastest and most significant fall in personal poll standing to significantly net negative in the period since. Yet I think if he were to turn that around, and right now with all that's going on with Barnaby, it might be good to open up a new front. If he were actually to turn that around and say, I am going to do these three things, and here's the agenda, and start to provide leadership, I think the electorate would cut him a lot of slack. And then the process you've got to go through, which my colleagues are talking about, is very important. I mean, I sort of think of policy in sort of three stages. There's the first stage of getting people to accept the magnitude and urgency of the problem or the challenge. Second stage is being prepared to lay out the options, get people debating the options and all the vested interests expressing their views about it and so on. And then finally determine your policy position and be prepared to go out and argue for it and fight for it over a period of time. But, you know, if you put an idea up one day and it doesn't last, you take it down, you're never going to get that sort of process underway. So I get quite frustrated when I see the outcome of bad policy. What we're doing is kicking issues down the road. I mean, I can't imagine going back over my time in the energy sector since the early 70s, early 80s, I should say, that we've ended up with a world where gas and electricity prices are running away simply because short-term politics has basically killed any sensible energy policy right through that period. And now it's going to be a dominant election issue, and we still don't have either side of politics coming up with a realistic, detailed, deliverable energy policy. And that's only one example of a public policy issue which is going to eat them all, simply because they haven't done anything about it.
So you've talked there about kicking issues down the road and particularly on energy. So I might turn to what the critical reforms as people see them are. Gary Banks, you did a productivity to-do list, which I think has been quoted repeatedly. What's on your list? Is that still the kind of program of reform that you think is critical? Are there particular things that you would pick out from that list?
Well, I should say when I put that list together, I didn't have any sort of idle, optimism about it being implemented, and that was borne out, I think. So there's still a lot of stuff on that list that I think would be relevant. But meanwhile, the Productivity Commission's produced an updated list, which I like to see as an embellishment of mine, which focuses a lot more on the public sector and the opportunity for better spending within the public sector. And there's no doubt that it's there. So, I mean, that list is about productivity, and ultimately living standards are driven by productivity. We had the sugar rush, a prolonged one of the terms of trade boom, but otherwise you're really looking at participation and productivity to get per capita income growth. One thing that bugs me, and it bugs me every time I hear the 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth, is that what really matters to our society is per capita income growth. It's living standards. And living standards are about people. They're not about aggregates, and they're not about the size of markets and so on. So I think, coming back to John's point, getting an understanding that it's about living standards and what drives those, I think is very important. And so the sorts of lists that have been done, not only by the Productivity Commission, but also more recently the Harper inquiry, Ken Henry's tax reform blueprint, from many years ago, which is still relevant, still has a lot of good stuff in it, and the tax debate is, I think, really misses the foundation that provided. So all of those things. So it really, I suppose, for me to come back to your question, the priority for me is not so much what to do, but how to achieve it. And John's right. There's been a lot of groundwork done. The handling of these reviews, selling the messages to the public, and then implementation is where the problems have come about. Whether they're cyclical problems or they're problems that are of longer duration because of the way the media operates, and there's no doubt, I think the 24/7 electronic media is a more difficult beast than the sort of media that was more predominant, in the 70s and early 80s. So there's a long list. I won't go into the detail of it, but anybody who wants to can still find the to-do list and the Productivity Commission's updated version.
Jane, do you agree with that kind of view from Gary that we do know what to do? more of the focus should be on how we do it, or do you think there are particular reforms that aren't kind of on the table that should be?
So I do agree with Gary, and I do think that the challenge of how is a real one. But I also think there's a broader conversation to be had with the community. And if you look at some people who we wouldn't necessarily on a day-to-day basis compare ourselves with and ask how are they travelling in the world, Sweden, for example, some of the Nordics. And they relatively high taxing, that's true, but they have very high labour market participation rates amongst women. They have pretty high labour market participation rates for older people. And they have a very science, tech-driven world. In other words, they're trying to be at the cutting edge of where markets are going to go. And the question I ask myself is, maybe this is the sluggish complacency. We have this very long history in resources. We have a very long history of just kind of expecting we're going to grow it or dig it up and then ship it off and that'll be what will carry us forward in terms of living standards. So I think in addition to what we need to do structurally, labour markets, tax, specific reforms to public sector policy or operations, all of which I agree with, I do think we need to start to think about who we are, what our image of ourselves is, because I think that really does influence things like the conversation we have with our kids about what kinds of jobs they might do, and the conversations we have with our friends or parents or whomever it might be, where someone actually said to me this morning, my husband, who left the public sector last year, and they said to me, "Isn't he retired?" And I said, "He's 58 years old. He's got a little bit of gas left in the tank." But do you know what I mean? It's that sort of pervasive attitude that says, well, you're just going to hang up your boots at a particular point. Now, we know for all sorts of reasons, including to do with the crisis we didn't really have, some people are continuing to stay in the labour market for economic necessity. I think the day we're having a conversation about older people wanting to genuinely stay in the labour market, stay connected to the community, and that's something we value and encourage, I think that will help us. So in addition to Gary's list, I'd say I think we need to have a broader social debate.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. John, anything that you'd add on that?
Look, I thought in '93 that it was worth taking a broad-based reform agenda just in every area really of public policy to the electorate. Might have been a crisis circumstance in the recession we didn't have to have. I thought we could probably go close to winning, and I think we did. And I thought there's a real urgency about some of that reform at that time. Today, there's an even greater urgency about reform in all those areas. And I don't care whether it's tax or budget repair or climate or education or health or whatever. We've seen problems not solved, issues kicked down the road, partially dealt with, band-aid jobs, whatever. No genuine broad-based reform to respond to the situation. But the issue is, how do you get to that reform agenda? I pick up Gary's point. I would think we need a unifying national objective of some sort, which will involve economic and social reform behind it. But to me, if we took the objective as, say, let's double our national productivity by, 2025 or 2030, and then go back to each area of public policy, what would we need to do in each of these areas to achieve that sort of strategic objective? In education, there's going to be quite a lot of thinking have to go on, because Gonski looks at what was wrong with the past. It doesn't do anything about the future. And the nature of education and technology is changing dramatically. In health, the demands are running away with the ageing of the population. The medical science are moving at a pace and so on. There are issues there, and go through each area of public policy. What do we need to do in education, higher education, vocational training, health, and innovation and technology, and all the elements of public policy. And that's what I think you need as a reform agenda, something that is genuinely broad-based. And you've got to break it up then into bite-sized chunks. Now, remember, in the Fraser government, we fought long and hard to get the Campbell inquiry up to start a process of reform. Our view was, if you could get the finance sector right, market-determined interest rates and exchange rates, then the world would move on to question tariff protection and centralised wage determination and infrastructure failings and so on. So we got this big report done, fine, very independent, substantive exercise, volumes of the report itself and all the supplementary technical papers that were produced, all sitting on Malcolm Fraser's desk. And on top of the desk was a piece of paper from one of his advisors which said, do you realise that if you read supplementary paper number, whatever it was, page something something in the footnote, it says that housing interest rates would go up by 2.5% if you actually deregulated the banking sector. So he took the whole series of volumes and threw them straight in the bin. And the answer was, well, you can't do that, Prime Minister. This is a ridiculous thing to contemplate. Expectations are out there. We've got huge community support, a great opportunity to reform the Australian economy and the social systems around it. So he said, what do you want to do? So we set up a task force to break all that into bite-sized chunks that could be done one by one. So we started setting market-determined government interest rates, moving towards a floating currency, licensing foreign banks, deregulate, but all in bite-sized chunks. So once you get the big objective right, you've then got to go back and say, what are the right bite-sized chunks to get this done so we can actually make progress? And our view in 83 was, that Fraser was going to lose government against Hawke. It was quite clear to most of us. But the snowball was big enough that it didn't matter who came into power, they were going to do it anyway. And, the Labor Party, people forget, in 1983, won that election with bank nationalisation still as a plank of their platform. And here they are, floating the currency, deregulating the banks, licensing foreign banks. There was an inevitability about the process. So it's just how you build that snowball, get it to a stage where in time, it doesn't matter who's in government, you actually get the reforms that have to be achieved.
If I could just make a quick comment there. I think, bringing the public along is such a crucial thing, and it's been underdone. So we've had, underprepared policy foisted on a essentially unprepared public. And as Jane says, that's a recipe for failure, really. And we can cite, I've got a slide that I show which has got about 20 policies down the left-hand side and a record of failure across all the elements of good process on the right. But the crucial one, I think, is getting the public to understand that there is a problem, and to get to that first stage. That's part of the problem we have, I think, with our federation, that we don't have the degree of agreement about problems before we proceed to alleged solutions. And we've just seen the Murray-Darling Basin plan kind of fall apart, which is a great shame because it affects so many people and it's another victim of politics. But you just wonder how much work had been done to get agreement across the jurisdictions about the problem and the need to hang in there.
The best recent example of just dropping it on the electorate was Abbott's first budget. We'll just announce a co-payment without any health policy within which to understand it. In the health sector, we'll announce a change in university funding without a higher education policy. Shouldn't be surprised that it got thrown out almost immediately.
Can I make one other comment about the challenge of reform? And New Zealand's been referred to. Now, New Zealand was comprehensively broke and everyone got it. And the population understood that there was going to be some tough times if they were going to get themselves back onto track. So we haven't had that. And the bottom line is telling the community we're in a bunch of trouble. They're starting to get it now, but at the time it was very difficult. There's an opportunity for governments, because if you can't crisis your way out of a problem and you struggle to get a long-run debate on things because people want to kill stuff off instantly, the point at which you do have an opportunity is when revenue starts to increase. So we all know, because people are making kind of warm, fuzzy noises, that the budget's looking to be in a better position. You don't have to be Einstein to spot the sort of none too subtle signals that are coming about how, the tax take's gone up and it's not quite as tough. I think the challenge for any government in that context is not, and I won't use the vernacular about what you might do with a wall, but is not to take the extra money that's coming in and just fritter it away. So if we accept in some cases that the best way to do a reform is to float everyone's boat, it's just some people's boat goes up more than others, if you've got more revenue coming in the door, you should actually take that opportunity to actually do some of these harder reforms, because we all know the more losers there are, the harder any reform process is. So one of the things I would suggest is, particularly at the moment where things are looking a fraction better, thinking about what that provides as an opportunity in a context where you've started a debate about reform. What reform could you buy with that increased revenue?
Can I just say that I was very envious of the New Zealand experience in policy reform in the 1980s, but they were greatly facilitated by the fact that they didn't have an upper house and they didn't have states. So the government of the day in a crisis could actually govern. And they did. And they got re-elected.
Just a quick further thing on New Zealand. NZOG had Bill English along to one of its conferences, and some of you may have been able to attend. And Bill and Joe Hockey are on the podium, and I was in your role there asking questions and so on. At one stage, Joe Hockey said to Bill, Bill had been talking about the reforms they'd got through, and he said, "Bill, that's amazing. What's the secret of your success?" And he said, "We copied Australia." Now, people were totally flummoxed by that. They didn't know what that meant. But it was really about, some of what he observed in Australia during the so-called reform era and how that worked. One of the problems is that the electorate at the moment has no trust in government. There's no political capital on which to build an ambitious reform agenda. And they have no trust in government because of the things that we've been talking about, the lack of process, the amount of surprises that have occurred without proper explanation. So building trust is crucial, and that preparatory period that John was talking about, getting people to understand the problem, is crucial to it, but then they also have to believe that government can actually implement a solution. There was a survey done of people's attitudes to tax reform. 2/3 of the respondents, it was a survey of a couple of thousand, I think, didn't believe that they could trust government to implement tax reform, and I think the record over the last few years bears that out.
And if anyone hasn't seen it, I strongly recommend you dig out the Edelman Trust Index and have a look at where bureaucrats, members of parliament are rated. The good news is we're above used car salesmen who haven't shifted their position from the bottom of the pile. But it's actually quite instructive about who is trusted, and I think almost nobody in this room gets into the trusted category.
And just to perhaps my final question before we go to the audience, but to pick up on the trust barometer and kind of the reputation of business, I guess a lot of people point to business and suggest that they should be playing a bigger role in the reform debate. Interested in your views.
Well, the good news is company directors are rated lower than most bureaucrats, so I've gone down the scale, guys.
John, do you have a view on that?
Well, look, I think reform is a collective process, and it's how you build that constituency, that collectivism in the process. And one of the problems that's happened, I think, in this drift towards very short-term opportunistic game that we call politics is that we've lost the desire of some of those stakeholders to actually be prepared to genuinely participate in that debate. I mean, the climate debate, for example, in the renewable energy area, everybody who entered that debate had their own model, right, which was they were arguing was the basis of evidence that should dictate the outcome of policy. But surprisingly, all those models that were produced, some quite different, confirmed the position of a particular vested interest that was putting them forward. It wasn't a constructive debate. And you've got to be prepared to take winners and losers. I mean, I've been arguing, say, with ACOS and others that, look, just don't argue for an increase in welfare benefits. And I agree, the pension's too low, the New Start allowance is too low. But in the context of actually delivering that, what are we going to do? Maybe we should be broadening, dare I say, broadening the base, increasing the rate of the GST or whatever. So it's broaden your thinking beyond just your particular vested interest. And that's a problem with the debate. It's vested interest based on, quite often on, to quote Trump, fake news, fake modelling, fake evidence to validate a point. So it's not constructive debate, and in the end it just runs aground.
Gary, we'll finish
I'll
with
just
you.
make two quick points. I think for a start, business has to stop being part of the problem. And my comment about rent seeking, I mean, business is not credible with the wider public when they're seen to be, trying to feather their own nest through particular subsidies or benefits or regulatory benefits and so on. So I think that's, that is an issue. I guess the second point is that, what was I going to say? We've seen recently the heads of major corporations almost assuming a political role statesmen and going out and being on the TV and so on. I don't think that works, actually. I don't think it actually works. And I think politicians will always be better at, as they say, there's an old saying, if you can fake sincerity, you've got it made. I think politicians are far better at faking sincerity than our business people.
So we've got a couple of roving mics. If you have a question, please put up your hand, and if you could just state your name and organisation before you ask your question, and no statements, please.
Or we could just keep talking.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel and for your insights. I have a question, actually it relates to a comment of yours, Jane, around the need for a broader social debate. And what do you think it will take to have that broader social debate? What needs to be done to take that inclusiveness approach?
So it's one of the great conundrums, because I think if we actually knew how to do it, we'd actually have started doing it. I think there are a couple of opportunities, and I do think if you look at the history of the past where people have run exactly as John Hewson says, let's talk about what the problem is, let's sort of socialise issues. And there are hooks that governments can use in terms of regular reporting from the Treasury, in terms of the impact of ageing, etc., on the population. Someone needs to be prepared to go out there and have a sustained debate. And once you get a sustained debate, if it's in an area that people are interested in, so women's labour market participation, we know is a major issue. What is it that's actually holding us back? The Canadians are so far in front of us, and we never like to be beaten by the Canadians, let's be honest. Older people, their participation in the community more broadly. So someone's got to be prepared to kick that off and keep it moving for a while. I think that then makes people think. That then leads you to some sort of policy options, et cetera, et cetera. So someone's got to take some responsibility, I think. And I accept Gary's point about business not necessarily being the right vehicle for that, because you always do look rent-seeking. Doesn't matter how genuine you are about it. But whether that's through some sort of discussion between business and the community and government, whether it's people who just have a particular interest in this and they have enough community credibility to be out there talking it up, I don't know, but I do think it's a conversation that's well worth having.
Look, I think a government can provide a lead in this respect by just starting out by publicly acknowledging that while we're on a reform agenda, we're not just reforming the economy, we're actually reforming society. There are a lot of dimensions to the debate that get lost if you just focus on the economy. And if you start to look at some of the big social issues like inequality and low levels of participation, closing the gap, whatever it is, you can translate that back, I think, to a meaningful strategy. For example, I would think it would be a good idea that every major cabinet submission, every major policy cabinet submission should have to have an inequality impact statement attached to it. So they actually think about what this might do to those who you're not particularly focusing on in making that policy. And there's a lot of those sort of issues which are pretty easy, I think, to deal with, but just get lost. We used to have environmental impact statements on cabinet decisions because people used to think about that. Then the environment got swept away as a dominant constraint. So we just go back to the economics of an answer, which is, or a policy which is not where it should be focused, exclusively where it should be focused.
Just if I can get back again to the New Zealand link, I think one of the secrets of the New Zealand success, which ultimately actually didn't see them retain government, I should say, so it's not so easy politically in New Zealand either these days, but one of the elements I think was no matter what reform they were putting forward, they always began their narrative with benefits to New Zealanders, about New Zealand households, about the New Zealand community. They always started with that. And then they backed up, and over time, obviously it was going to mean cost cutting somewhere or more efficiencies or whatever, but they didn't start with that technical efficiency productivity talk. They talked about benefits to New Zealand people. And I think, that was very important, and that's part of that element of bringing people along, because if they realise the problem is something that, if it's resolved, is going to benefit them individually and collectively and their own families, that's obviously makes a difference. But I don't think, even if Bill, as Bill says, they got that approach from us, we don't seem to have pursued it. and maybe the ACT will be an exception. We heard a very good speech at lunchtime from the Chief Minister, which shows that that idea that good policy can be made to be good politics is alive and well and living in the ACT, at least perhaps. But it needs to be much broader.
The big change in New Zealand was the change in the voting structure. In the 80s, when Longy came into and inherited that crisis from Piggy Muldoon, I mean, he had complete authority to do it as a government. And they introduced the MNP, which has meant that none of the major parties will ever continue to govern in their own right. They'll always have to take one or two minorities with them to form a government. And that's made it harder to win, it's harder to get a mandate, it's harder to govern. I think you can argue that both ways, because bringing some of those minor parties in has elevated issues that perhaps might have been swept under the carpet if only one party had been in power. So it's a trade-off. But our system is working against us in terms of Senate representation.
Another question here at the front.
Thank you. John Ross from Westpac. You touched on the breakdown of trust, and I'd be quite keen to hear from the panel. Successful societies obviously have strong leadership at a political level and at a corporate level, but we seem to have this breakdown of trust, certainly from a banking perspective. But you talked about bureaucrats and politicians. I'd just be interested in, what would be a practical way, do you think, that we could try and rebuild trust?
So, in truth, we all understand trust has dropped, and we all understand that people live in much more of an echo chamber than they ever used to. You'll have seen the adverts on the ABC, so you can personalise your news feed. So what does that mean? You personalise it to stuff you want to hear about that actually conforms with your views. So in an environment where something you see is not congruent with your views, I think that leads to this, one of the problems we have with trust. I think the best antidote to trust is consistency and being genuine. And ultimately, if people actually understand that your motives are above board, you're very clear about them, and you don't tend to spin a story, and most particularly, you don't tell a whole swathe of untruths you get caught with. And certainly we're seeing that in the corporate sector. Somebody asked me about how ANZ is going. People know I'm now a director of ANZ, and I talked about Shane Elliott, who's the CEO, who is both humble and extraordinarily genuine, and I said, he's the man for the times. Because the notion that people are prepared to tolerate or believe someone who looks and sounds and behaves like a spiv, it just isn't the world we live in. So if you're going to crack through that echo chamber that people so increasingly are living in, and you probably all know that the smart analytics mean that when you go Google something, they will know what kind of interest you have, and you will get something back, even if you Googled an issue of public interest, that actually reflects your profile and your views. If you're somebody quite different, you would see a completely different set of results. So you are in an echo chamber by definition. So the best antidote to that, I think, is to be very, very honest and very, very open and genuine. But even then, it's going to be hard.
Yeah, look, I think honesty and performance are the two keys. I mean, you don't promise something that you don't think you can deliver, and you then deliver it against those expectations. One of the tragedies, I thought, of my fight back package in the early 90s was I understated the revenue deliberately. We got numbers, hard numbers, cranked out by Access Economics as to what revenue we generate from changing the tax structure. And so I said, let's just take 75% of that. Because I wanted to be the first Prime Minister in history to over-deliver a tax cut rather than under-deliver it or claw it back in some other form. Now, I guess if you want to make changes in our system, we have truth in advertising laws in business and in the community, apply them to politics. We have very significant penalties in the corporate sector for false and misleading conduct. Apply them to politics. Those standards, we've got code of conduct being done, let's make it one based on truth and honesty, and we might see some dramatic changes in the system.
All right. I think we've got time for one last question, if there's anyone. No? All right, we might draw things to a close. We do have a small token of our appreciation for the panel for their insights today, and could you please join with me in thanking the panel?